So, good afternoon. I am Dr. David Clark. I'm the Executive Associate Dean in the College of Business Administration. I'm also an economics professor. And it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone in the audience today to the 2022 Marburg Memorial Lecture. So let me just tell you a little bit about the Marburg Lecture Series. The Marburg Lecture Series is an annual lecture, and it's actually made possible because of the generosity of a former faculty member, the late Dr. Theodore Marburg, as well as his family. Dr. Marburg was a longtime member of the Department of Economics, and he retired from full-time teaching in 1973. So he's had a long career at Marquette. He retired in 1973, and then he taught part-time for us for a while. He was a superb teacher, and one of the indications of that is he was awarded the Marquette University Faculty Award for Teaching Excellence in 1968. That's given out to about 3 people a year to the entire Marquette community. So he was an excellent teacher. He was also a distinguished scholar, though. He published on topics such as the development of capitalistic economies and the role that economics has played in the development of American civilization. One can see that Dr. Marburg's research, and many of his former students would also attest to the fact that his teaching also showed the importance of bringing economics and economic principles into the explanation of who we are as a society and who we are as a nation. And so he was very broad in terms of his research emphasis. The goal of the Marburg Memorial Lecture Series is to really provide a forum for the discussion of moral, philosophical, and social dimensions of economic issues, as well as to continue Dr. Marburg's commitment to investigating the economic aspects of peace and justice. As a result of the generosity of the Marburg family endowment, we have been privileged to be able to bring leading economists to campus for this event for over 2 decades. Just to give you a sense of how strong some of the scholars that we brought to Marquette are. In the last 5 years, we brought 2 Nobel Econ winners to this event. So it is truly my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this year's Marburg Memorial Lecture. I do want to point out one thing. There is going to be a time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. And so if you do have a question, a microphone will be set up in the center aisle, and we just ask that you go to the microphone so that the rest of the audience can hear your question, and it can also be part of the video that's being prepared for this event. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our provost, Dr. Kimo Ayun, to introduce our speaker.
It's great to see so many of you here. You know, we talk about the life of a university, and this is an example of how it's played out, about sharing ideas and being able to bring speakers who add an entirely new dimension to your university. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Rohini Pande is the Henry J. Heinz Professor of Economics and the Director of Economic Growth Center at Yale University. She earned a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, a BA and MA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Harvard University, and a BA in economics from Delhi University. Her research is focused on formal and informal institutions and how they shape power relationships and patterns of economic and political advantage in society, particularly in developing nations. And when we think about being part of a Catholic Jesuit institution, and we think about the questions we're supposed to ask and what we're supposed to be thinking about, her research fits exactly into our mission about how we think about access and how we think about others. Her most recent work focuses on testing innovative ways to make the state more accountable to its citizens, ensuring that environmental regulations reduce harmful emissions, providing citizens effective means to voice their demands for state services, and strengthening women's economic and political opportunities. Her research fits well with the Marburg Lecture series. And so with that, I would like to have you join me in welcoming the 2022 Marburg Lecture speaker, Dr. Rohini Pande.
Thank you very much for the generous invitation to come here, and I'm delighted to have spent the day here and met many of you, and also seen the new building that the department is going to move into, so many congratulations for that. In thinking about what to talk about today, I wanted to strike some balance between, I think, some of the issues that we've seen emerge in especially the developing world in the context of coming out of the pandemic, but also at the same time try to think a little bit more positively about where change can come from. And so that really is, I think, what underlies my talk. You know, there's a lot of discussion often, especially I think at the end of the 20th century, around the promise of economic growth and how economic growth could be the tide that lifts all boats. I think what we've seen over the last, I'd say 2 or 3 decades is, you know, economic growth is an extremely important force. It's a force that has, and I'll show you some data on that in a minute, has done immense good when it comes to the poor in the world. But as we also look around the world at inequality, as we look at how the pandemic reshaped the health opportunities available to individuals, we realize that in many ways growth is never going to be enough. And so that's really what I want to think of today's talk as being about. I want to talk about what happens when the tide turns. How do we at those points of time think about combining growth with other forms of economic and policy activism in order to ensure that we don't have groups, and very often these tend to be members of historically disadvantaged groups, who get left further behind. So what I want to do today, just to give you a sense of where the talk will go, I want to start by talking about where the world's poor are. And of course, you know, measuring poverty in itself is a very political debate. I'm going to stay a little bit away from that and really just rely on the statistical definitions that, you know, colleagues have come up over the years, which is to really think of the world's extreme poor as those who have less than $1.90 a day to survive on. And just to remind many of you, you know, in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals had deemed that the first and most important goal of economic and public policy is going to be to end such extreme poverty by 2030. Obviously, with COVID, that is no longer feasible, but I think it's useful to remind us what growth did for affecting where the poor are. I want to then turn to sort of how we can respond if it's not just going to be about growth. I want to first think about the role that fiscal redistribution can play. Can we do a lot by just reducing corruption in lower income countries, by making sure that whatever money is being given out, you know, less of it disappears along the way into the pockets of the corrupt. And then I want to argue you can get somewhere with that, but you're never going to get far enough because in the end, what you need is you need, you know, the poor, the more disadvantaged, to actually be able to directly affect the amount of money that's being redistributed, not just how it's being redistributed. And I think that brings us centrally to issues of thinking about access to power. And here I'm going to hone into one group, a group that I've studied for a long time, which is to think about poor women in India and how do they actually try to access power and whether and how they are able to succeed with it. So that's the overall talk. So let me start with just going through some data to remind you about just the trends over time. So I think this is a dramatic decline that we I think, start pretty much every development economics class with. So what the blue line reminds us is that in 1981, which is when data started being collected, roughly 45% of the world's population had less than $1.90 a day to live on each. Largely because in the early years, because of the East Asia miracle, we saw a dramatic decline. And over the 21st century, a lot of this decline came from South Asia. So South Asia is the orange line above it. What you do see, however, is a bump at the end. And this bump in the end is COVID. So now that we've had some time to look at the data of 2020, World Bank estimates suggest that 70 million people were pushed into poverty in 2020. It's the single largest increase in poverty in a year since global poverty monitoring began in the world. And certainly it's the first year in the 21st century that we saw an increase. It's also the case that we know no longer that 2030 is not the year where we are going to end extreme poverty by. That's gone out of the window with COVID. But there is an important question of what can we do to make sure that this bump that we see in the bottom lines is not something that becomes permanent but can be reversed back down. The second thing to remember is that as economic growth occurred, as populous countries like China and India and Indonesia became richer, what reduced was cross-country inequality. So there is now less inequality in the world if you measure it at the level of countries. But there is actually more inequality in the world if you measure the level within countries. So countries like Latin American countries have always been very unequal, but we are seeing a fast catch-up, unfortunately, from countries in East and South Asia in terms of increase in inequality. And if anything, this phenomenon slightly magnified during the pandemic. Taken together, these two facts that we've seen a lot of economic growth in erstwhile poor countries, but we have not seen this distributed across equally across all individuals, means that a fact that used to be true in 1980 isn't true anymore. Some poor people live in poor countries, but the majority of poor people now live in countries that are not low income, but are lower middle income. So what you see in blue are countries that are, according to the World Bank Index, defined as being lower middle income, which is typically having a GDP per capita of around $5,000 or above. And there are large populous countries like India, Nigeria, Indonesia, and Kenya that are now doing well. They're growing fast, but they also have large bodies of the world's poor. And I think this is extremely important to keep in mind, because if you want to target extreme poverty, you can no longer just say that I will go and target DRC or Angola. You have to think about what can we be doing to change policy in these lower middle income countries, and that's a much harder issue in some ways. So as I said, if we take these high poverty middle income countries, so I want to define a high poverty country that has at least 1% of the world's extreme poor. And as I said, they're kind of middle income is an important category because you're no longer aid eligible by the World Bank definition, so you no longer will get subsidized loans. There are these 5 countries that are marked here, India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Kenya, that are roughly home to half of the world's extreme poor. And what's striking to see is how large these disparities within countries can be. So just to give you an example, on the left-hand side, I've shown the data from 2 low-income countries, 2 classic poor countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia. So if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, it has one of the lowest GDPs per capita of $520. Now turn to Nigeria and India, but let's look at regions within them rather than the whole country. So if you take the state of Bihar in India, which is a state I'm actually going to return to later in the talk, it has 127 million people. It's very populous, and its GDP per capita is somewhere between Ethiopia and DRC. So if you actually asked if Bihar was a country, it would be the world's low-income, most populous country, and it would also be defined as a fragile country because it's marked by a lot of civil conflict. So increasingly, when we think about development policy for the extreme poor, we need to think about how do you actually reach a state like Bihar within India, or how do you reach northern Nigeria, not just asking how do you negotiate loans with the president or the Ministry of Finance in Nigeria in Washington, D.C. So let me just summarize one level down. today when we look at poverty statistics around the world, what is the demography of the world's poor? As I said, they largely live in middle-income countries. What is true, has always been true, is the poor largely live in rural areas and earn from agriculture. So roughly 80% are going to be in agriculture. There's some move out of, 80% are in rural areas. There is some move out of agriculture, but they're still largely agricultural. Another change that's taken place is education has increased. So again, if you were in 1980 or 1990, if you think of Professor Amartya Sen's work, there was a lot of argument that education could be the great leveler. Individuals would get educated, they would get jobs in manufacturing services, they would move out. Now what we see, primary schooling in itself is no longer enough. 40% of the world's extreme poor have completed primary schooling but are still very poor. And then the last fact is that poor families tend to have larger households, and as a result, young children are often overrepresented in the world's poor. So 45% of the world's poor are actually under the age of 14. And this is important because as many countries in Western Europe and Eastern Asia are going to start aging, the demographic dividend is going to come off these children who are in sub-Saharan Africa and who are in India. And then finally, and this is the place where I want to go, is I want to remind us that as these trends are changing, the other trend that's changing is where do the poor live? So what this graph shows you, it shows you data of the proportion of the poor, extreme poor, who live in different types of electoral regimes. So the light green line is being a full autocracy, and the decline really marks the decline of poverty in China. So think of the light green line really picking up China. What I want to highlight is the increase in the green and the light orange lines just above, which are countries which are either where the independent election monitors say elections are not clean, or they say elections are clean, but actually it's not translating to much redistribution. And that's the challenge. You have increasingly the poor living in what are called electoral autocracies. You have elections, someone is getting elected as a leader, but they're quite autocratic in how they're ruling, and they are not putting a lot of weight on redistribution as a form of development. And why does this matter? I think this matters a lot because, again, if we think about these lower middle income countries as the ones that matter for poverty reduction for a lot of the extreme poor, these are countries that don't depend on aid, right? So China, if anything now, is a net aid exporter. I think it's actually just set up its own aid agency. Pakistan and Bangladesh do get some amount of aid, although Pakistan, I think, has begun to decline. But countries like Indonesia, India, and others are really not looking at aid as where they're going to get the resources from. Rather, what matters for them is public social expenditure. So really, if we want to think about how to translate the gains of growth to the poor in ways other than just by having work in the labor market, we're going to either have to improve the amount we tax, or we have to change how we transfer. And that's really some of what I want to talk about today. So the first part I want to turn to now is, in this setting, should we think about just improving the efficiency of fiscal collection? You hear this very often. We're now in a new digital era. You have things like different ways in which you can really use, for instance, blockchains to know what transactions have taken place. Can we just reduce corruption to such a minimum in these countries that we actually then have gains in poverty reduction without having to spend more? This, in some ways, would be a technocrat's dream. It's a win-win solution. You just stop lining you use technological advances, use digital advances to just increase how you transfer resources to the poor. So the first thing I want to remind us is that before we even turn to what is the best way of doing it, is to remind us that cash transfers have a long and, I would say, quite glorious history when it comes to poverty reduction. More recently, there's been, in the context of development, we've seen an increasing number of field experiments that have looked at cash transfers in different forms. And we find no systematic evidence that cash transfers discourage work. This was also true, for instance, I think, of the pandemic cash transfers in the US. There was no evidence that those in itself reduced work. In contrast, what I think we see in the development literature is that well-designed cash and asset transfer programs can have transformative effects, not just by directly allowing people the resources to, say, get food, but also because they have what we would say Keynesian or general equilibrium effects, that they might actually increase labor demand in a village economy. If someone has more money and they can hire workers, it may actually change consumption patterns and increase demand for goods produced. So just to give you two examples, Give Directly, which some of you in the audience may have heard of, is an NGO that provides just direct cash transfers to the poor, where they target the poor through satellite imagery to see that if you have the kind of roof that looks like it's a temporary roof, then you will get it. So they try to cut through all the concerns of corruption by saying we will not go through the state, we will just directly transfer through mobile phones resources to the poor targeted by satellite imagery. They found they gave over $1,000 per household in Kenya as a one-off transfer, found very significant effects. A different type of transfer, which has been very popular in South Asia but has expanded, is what are known as ultra-poor asset transfer programs, where you give ultra-poor is, as you can imagine, a category beyond extreme poor. I'm not sure what I think about this continuous cutting of it, but you give very poor households livestock largely, and you hope that this helps them, especially because the very poor tend to not have land, but live in villages, some form of raising income. And again, they find that actually these kind of transfers seem to help households get out of poverty traps. But I think, and this is the big but, these transfers need to be large to have an effect. So in the Eggers et al., if you annualize those cash transfers, you need to give something like 15% of the GDP in the treatment villages to have an effect. And in the asset transfer program, they found that these transfers could work, but only for those who already had a bit of money, not for those who were the very poorest. So what that tells you that if you wanted to, say, do this at scale in these lower middle income countries, and you're not going to rely on aid, you have to ask, are they going to be able to raise those taxes to do it? So let me just show you what the size of government looks like in these countries. So I think the first piece of data, which would be familiar to all of you, is if you look at high-income countries, think of the US or Western Europe, we know starting 1960, as for instance the US, the war on poverty began, we saw an increase in government spending as a share of GDP, and it's largely, I'd say, flattened out at something like 20% in rich countries. If you look at low-income countries, it also saw an increase, and then it sort of bumps around. It saw another increase, for instance, at the turn of the 21st century when there was the big Jubilee debt reduction, but it's around 15% in the poorest countries, and a lot of this is going to be on aid. If you look at other middle-income countries, these countries you're seeing, are trending towards looking like rich countries. But the group that stands out, and I think is deeply concerning for that reason, is these high-poverty middle-income countries. These are countries that have recently transitioned from a low-income to a lower middle-income status. They've lost aid eligibility, but they have not managed to increase their tax base. And indeed, if you look at the data, the difference between the red and the orange line is largely explained by the disappearing aid. And so, so I think this puts in sharp perspective the question you'd want to ask. Should you be improving implementation in order to target better? Should you, for instance, reduce corruption? Or is the answer political, that we need to increase taxation, we need to have a lot more wealth and capital tax at the top end of the income distribution? Questions that I think similarly are being discussed right now, I'd say, in the US or even in Western Europe. So let me start by talking about some work I've done in the state of Bihar, which I highlighted to you as a state that would count as one of the poorest countries if it was a country, not a state, and really turn to this idea of, why does corruption occur in transfer systems? And I think what economists would say that an important reason this occurs is because you make transfers in a system of delegated governance. There's someone at the top who's releasing the money. It's going to a mid-level bureaucrat who then has to sign some piece of paper, and then it goes to a frontline worker who then dispenses the cash. Along the way, there's not great information, and so there's a lot of opportunities for a midline bureaucrat or frontline worker to perhaps take a cut of the resources that they are then in charge of giving out. Now, one hope here, and this comes back to the hope of digital payments, is pushed by many, is that, well, maybe what digital systems will let you do is cut out all the middlemen. All I need is I need the person who needs to, the beneficiary, to have a digital bank account, and then the top person can directly transfer into it. So it's like the Give Directly program on steroids. And if I can do this, I cut out, if you will, one of the most important agency problems, which is humans in the chain. And so I want to look at one of these, and I want to ask, does it do two things? First, does it affect corruption, as we posit? But importantly, even if it does reduce corruption, is it automatic that less corrupt programs reach more people? Because the second one that really matters from the perspective of a poor person. A poor person hates the money getting lost, but doesn't matter to her whether the money is not released by the government or is being taken by someone along the way. In both cases, it doesn't reach her. So I'm going to focus on, and this is a program I'm going to come back to a couple of times during the talk, so I'll just take a couple of minutes to tell you about it. The backbone of social protection systems in rural India comes of a federal workfare program where each household is guaranteed 100 days' work at a fixed minimum wage if they want to. It's been a controversial program for some reasons, including the fact that the work is unskilled labor, but certainly during the pandemic, it turned to be an extremely important lifeline. The roughly cost to the government of this program is 0.5% of the GDP, so it's a large program. It's financed by the central government that sends the money to the state, and then the state then has to approve spending by local governments, which are village governments, which are then responsible to paying out to the citizens. And as you can see, so the beneficiary selection, so choosing who in the village is going to get the work is done by the village government, so that's a person. And I think this is an important part of something that cannot be outsourced to digital unless you really think something like satellite imagery or the way Give Directly does it can happen at scale. And then there's also, because there is someone who's responsible for choosing beneficiaries, there's always the possibility of leakage at that point. At the minimum, I could collude with the villager if I was a local chief. I could say, look, I'll get the $10, you and I can split it, and I won't ask you to work. And if I have any disutility of working, I might agree to some split. And that's going to be very hard to identify because the villager is not going to go and whistleblow because she is colluding. And so in most of these systems, you also have some amount of oversight by superiors who have to sign off on the payment slips, even if the final payment is digital. So as I'm going to focus on the state of Bihar, it has 34% of its population in 2012 were extremely poor. And there was high levels of rationing in the scheme. Even though it was meant for everyone, the poorest were not able to get it. As I mentioned, the status quo, the local government needs to get sign-off from multiple authorities in order to get the cash advance against which they would open up work. And this control of funds at every stage, so the local government says, I have 50 workers who need to work, but I need the cash in hand before I can give it to them. This would mean that many people would sign off and each of them could take a cut from you. And when we surveyed the village heads, they claimed that they roughly had to spend 25% of the final expenditure coming to the village in order to get funds released. So what we conducted was a large-scale field experiment. One of our colleagues and co-authors on this was actually in the government at this time, where what we changed was in the control you had in the status quo system, you had local officials just sending requests for advance payments and providing the work once it's released, while in the treatment, and just for students in the audience who may not have seen field experiments, whether a village is in the control or treatment group is defined by a lottery, which means that ex ante we expect them to be identical. And then in the treatment system, what we did is we completely cut out the system of needing ex ante approvals. Rather, the government official would give someone work and then would directly upload their bank details onto a centralized system, and then that would go through the various layers of banking, and then the money would get into the account of the villager. So it cut out essentially a whole layer of oversight. And so the question we really wanted to ask is, by having this kind of just-in-time financing that cuts out the need for approvals from humans beforehand, and also increased transparency because you're releasing money against observed names of people on the wage bill, does this improve program performance? So this is the first result we see, that in the period of the intervention, in treatment areas, we just saw less spending. Now, this can be very concerning when you see it. You could say you've put in a new system, people are not used to it, and maybe we're actually doing harm because we see less spending. So just to give you a sense, we saw a drop of roughly 24% in program expenditure in treatment areas. So we did a set of household surveys and matched data, and what we found is there was no change in work provision according to households surveyed. But where we did find an effect is that every year, government officials and elected officials have to provide affidavits of what assets they own. And if they're found to have falsified this, they lose their position, so there's some incentive at least to find real effects. And we found that there was a reduction in the affidavit asset declarations of the local officials in treated areas. So if you ask, what did this better digital machine do? It reduced the ghost households who claimed NREGA payments, and we also saw a reduction in the official wealth and treatment relative to the control, which roughly accounted to a third of the missing funds. But you could also ask, what did it not do? It actually didn't increase the work available to households. So it wasn't the case that once corruption fell, you actually saw increase in work. Rather, what we saw happening was this actually became a good way for the government, who was trying to figure out how to deal with their fiscal deficit, to actually balance their books better. So rather than saying we've saved 24%, let's push it out to more citizens, they were like, let's use this 24% to reduce the deficits in our budget. And also what was playing out was the political economy of reform. You know, the central government that financed the program, it also didn't share the political identity of the state government. It felt that if it used this money to expand the program, the state government would get credit, it would not. And so it was scaled up, but largely seen as a tool of fiscal efficiency, not a tool of trying to redistribute better. And so that's really the kind of example why I'd say that, I think, of course, we should fight corruption. Of course, we should use digital tools if we can, but we should also be clear-eyed about the fact that these digital tools are not going to empower the poor. So that's a place where I'm talking about it happening at the level of a village. I want to give you a second very quick example, which comes from thinking about within the household and from microfinance. So there have been numerous studies that have tried to look at what are the impacts of either cash transfers or capital transfers to women through microfinance programs, comparing that to what happens when you give similar cash transfers to men. And one effect that they typically find is when you give cash transfers to women, their own enterprises don't grow. When you give cash enterprises to men, enterprises owned by the men grow. And what we found is when we did a meta-analysis of multiple of these studies, and we said what we found really matters is the unit of measurement. If the unit of measurement is at the household level, so you measure household income, or all the enterprises in a household added up together, then actually it doesn't matter who you give money to. And this is something that, you would learn in Econ 101, money is fungible within a household. It'll go to where the highest return activity is. So in that sense, the household was efficient. But what it highlighted was the fact that what was perhaps inefficient was the fact that women were continually pushed into the low return enterprises in the household. This could be because they were seen as the secondary owners. They were the ones who had to manage the household work at the same time and trying to do a little bit of business. And so this again told you that the way that power was playing out within the household wasn't necessarily in terms of where the money was finally ending up, but who was getting what business. And so this brings me to, I think, the second part of my talk, where really what I want to talk about is thinking about identity and power. And how is it that we can actually understand these as levers that really affect either the effects of cash transfer, or now I'm going to actually slightly pivot and directly talk about an ability to access labor markets. Because I think the first step in trying to affect change that many governments try to do is not actually provide continuous cash transfers every month to the poor because they can't afford it. It's try to increase their access to the labor market. And so given that, I think it's important to ask, how can you access the labor market? And I think across the world, I'm going to focus in on India, but across the world, markers of social identity correlate both with economic well-being, and labor markets just are a central force in this. We find in many cases that you could think about, unionization efforts by low-skilled workers in the US right now, or you can think about, what's happening in Bangladeshi garment factories. In all cases, what we see is, typically an attempt to limit the extent of returns of capital that go to workers. As companies get more profitable, it's not as if automatically there's a link very often to worker wages. And so what I want to do is I want to take the example of women to talk about how institutions can determine these power asymmetries between genders and women's access to labor markets. What I want to first start by just pointing out is women use labor markets a lot less among the extreme poor. So this is just looking at the set of the world's extreme poor and saying what is their labor market status. If you look at men, they're largely in informal sectors. They're either self-employed or they may be paid workers. But very few of them are unemployed or out of the labor force because they can't afford to be. They're very poor. In contrast, 50% of the world's extreme poor women are out of the labor force, and again, largely driven by South Asia. They're more likely to be working in agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And as a result of this, for instance, in South Asia, for every 100 men who live in poor households, 109 women live in poor households. Some of this is coming from widows at the older age distribution, but it's also coming from women who just never enter the labor force throughout their life. And why do we care? One of the reasons we care is because economic resources, access to economic resources brings you women's empowerment. So this uses a whole series of measures like who has decision-making power, extent of violence faced, and looks by education levels at the decision-making of women, whether it varies by the type of work. And in all cases, what you can see that the lightest line, which is the not working, are the least empowered. So, of course, there should be wages for housework, and I don't want to take a stance on, what men and women should do with their time. They should do what they prefer to do as long as they can earn a living from it. But it does appear that there are a lot of women who want to work, and their inability to work affects their agency. So why don't poor men and women work at comparable rates? And I think this is where the role of gender norms becomes very important. I think in many societies, starting from Britain in the Industrial Revolution time, but at all points, this notion of the separate spheres ideology got mainstreamed in societies where you have the idea that the man should be the breadwinner, while the woman's sphere of influence should start at the household. What this also did is it ended up justifying prescriptive gender norms about what makes for appropriate behavior. So these are both actual norms, what men and women believe is appropriate behavior, and then perceptions of other people's belief. And that matters because that's often what you do is not because you think it's right or wrong, it's because you think others would punish you if you transgress the norm. And this then, I think, in society in general, got accompanied by the passage of gendered labor laws that itself then emphasized male breadwinner ideals. So just to give you a sense of where I'm going, and I'll probably take another 10 minutes to conclude after this, the main argument I want to make is that in today's world, sustainably escaping poverty is a lot more than just a daily transfer of $1.90. Certainly some of it is weak state implementation capacity and technocratic solutions like digital ways of transferring money can help. But it's also because we have institutions that are controlled by the elite and designed to exclude groups. And so I think what we want to really ask is the question is how do we take institutions, ranging from those implemented by the family to the state, and what kind of policy interventions can enable a more equitable distribution of power? And this is a difficult question because in many countries, the state hesitates to enter the household. This could be, you can see this in the unwillingness of the state often to, say, legislate on something like marital rape in many developing countries. But it's also, unwillingness to ask what are we doing to ensure that a transfer that is meant for a woman in the household stays with her and is spent as she wants? So I think in that sense, this is not an anodyne statement to make, to say that if you want to do policy seriously for women, you will actually sometimes have to enter the household. I think that goes counter to, I think, even I'd say the legal status quo in many developing countries. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the design of gender-intentional policies in labor and financial sectors. Again, I'm going to focus on India, and just to remind you why India is, unfortunately, a good country to do. What this graph shows you, it shows you kind of female labor force participation. Each dot is a country, and it's colored in different years for 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2019. They're population-based circles, so India is a large circle. And what you can see throughout the period, India is off what we will call the regression line. So the U-shape is something that Claudia Golden made famous, this idea that when you leave out of agriculture, women first exit the labor market and then come back later when jobs are very well paying. What you see is in India, you just see a continuous decline in female labor force participation, and it's much lower than comparable countries at the same level of GDP. And I think that there's a general acceptance that an important reason for this is gender norms. So I'm going to just show you first some data, which is from a sample of a socially conservative area in Madhya Pradesh, where the average age of marriage was 15, 32% reported spousal violence in the last year, and only 26% were working. These are just their own stated beliefs on whether you believe women should work, whether you believe it's most important in life to be obedient to a husband, and whether you think community respect matters. And what's important to see is that, men tend to have stronger beliefs that women shouldn't work, but also I think both groups, but particularly men, put quite a lot of weight on community respect. And this matters because when we look at perceived beliefs, what we find quite a significant difference in that men are much more concerned about the social cost they will face of being derided by their village community as being seen as not a good husband if their wife works. We then ran some kind of lab in the field experiments of offering men and women work, and what we found is that women were less likely to work when their husbands stated the belief that women shouldn't work, and also when women perceived that their husbands had these beliefs. The second thing that did matter was community beliefs. If a husband believed that the community will think badly if their wife works, then the wives are less likely to work. And so in these environments, I think the policy question begins. There are women, and the women stated to us they wanted to work, they had more liberal beliefs, but they faced opposition from their husband. What could they do? So what we tried to do is we ran a field experiment where we compared women to whom we gave just bank accounts, so everyone got bank accounts, to women where we not just gave them bank accounts, but said that if you enroll in the federal workfare program, if you remember I talked about earlier, we would ensure that there was direct deposits into your bank. And there's actually a long history, even from the US, about the time when women got full financial agency, what that did. And so what we're comparing is across a sample of women who all now have access to bank accounts. Does it matter if actually you know that the payments for your work will come into your account, not into your husband's account? The status quo would be that the payment would go into the main account in the household, that would be the husband's. So that's just what we did. We had various ways of collecting data. And then we also kind of measured norms, and these are the questions that I talked about earlier. So this is what the data tells us, and I think the main thing I want you to do is to compare the top line, which is the dark blue line, with the light blue line, which is, with the gray line, which is accounts only. And so what you see is over this time period, we then looked at administrative data, and we found that those women who had access to direct deposits were actually working at a much higher rate. So when we look at the axis of labor market engagement, we see significant gains. And these are the most largest for those who said that at baseline they were constrained by their husband's beliefs. We also, which I thought was very reassuring, find some evidence that women's norms become more progressive, but less that at least in the short run, men's become more progressive. Now, why do we care? And let me come to this title of the paper as I conclude, which is really on when the tide runs out. So what this shows you is basically spending under this program as COVID hit. So the dark line, the straight vertical line is end of March 2020 when India went into complete lockdown. And what you see after that in the blue line is spending under this program of NREGA versus the orange line, which is what was true the last 3 years. So there's a huge demand in rural areas of individuals from this work. And when we tracked the women who had entered our study, and what we found throughout this period, that those women who we had 2 years, 3 years earlier, provided direct deposit accounts, were better able to enter and earn in the labor market through this program during the COVID pandemic. So again, we find that this sort of empowerment, which really started with financial empowerment, had improved their ability to deal with these shocks. I'm going to jump through this. And so I think if I was to conclude, I'd say that, we've had at least half a century, I'd say since the end of the World War II, of really focusing on economic growth, of really thinking about that is going to be the way we're going to affect poverty. What we're learning today is that is an important part, but it's not the only part, especially in a world with climate change where we don't, and automation, where just the power of economic growth is reducing. I think we need to think a lot more about institutions, both how institutions are going to help the poor, provide the poor with resources, but importantly, how they're going to help them demand those resources. And I think this also brings us to what I think of as the catch-22 of policy reform. How do you get the powerful to agree to give up power to the powerless? It's a difficult question, but I think it's one we need to tackle with, and perhaps even as researchers, we sometimes don't tackle it enough. It's nice to think of technocratic solutions where we say there is no efficiency equity trade-off, win-win, everyone can win. There will be losers if we want to move towards a fairer world in some ways. And I think it's important to remember that, development economics, unlike I think some other sub-disciplines in economics, has at many points been very comfortable with a normative goal of saying something like we want to end deprivation or we want economic justice. These are not efficiency goals. And I think if we really take to heart these normative goals, I think then we will have to engage, even though it's not something that comes in our most basic toolkit, with these questions of how to change power structures. I think especially at a time right now when we're trying to think about what to do with all the many crises in the world. Thank you very much.